welcome to GizmoSapiens Show 275. I'm Chris, and with me today is,
I am Matt.
and we're going to talk about transportation. So this is all about, you know, transport tech, and it's a sector under pressure from regulation, economics, and real-world safety debates. On the EV side, the UK is moving towards a mileage-based tax, which is very reminiscent of mileage-based taxes like in New Zealand. Ford is trimming its EV ambitions, and new U.S. rules are forcing automakers to strip out Chinese software dependencies. Um, we're also, autonomous vehicles are becoming a bigger thing. We kind of scoffed at it a couple years ago,
Still kind of do.
and we still kind of do. But Waymo um, is has a burgeoning, successful robotaxi business to
And
carry crime across your cities.
I was just gonna say, as we learned in our last episode, a burgeoning criminal
But they're
uh,
not they're not the only one in the
conspiracy.
robotaxi business, and
Yeah.
eventually it's going to become pervasive. Now, what will be interesting, as a side note, as we're introducing this topic, is you're going to get it in big cities with big populations first. Where fewer people have personal vehicles and they utilize Uber and Waymo and Lyft and traditional taxi services um first. So we talk about Waymo, and they're really embedded in San Francisco, which is the heart of Silicon Valley. um but expect to see it happen in places like New York and Los Angeles, and uh on the big cities on the coasts first. What will be more interesting is get 5-10 years down the line and how it rolls out into places like where we are, where we have big cities like Lexington and Columbus and Cincinnati and Dayton and Indianapolis. But um the cities are not unlike the West, where the cities are just massively spread out, but our cities are less compact and more spread out, and um, than they are on both the East and West Coast.
Well, Ohio is one of the states that's being targeted
Well,
for
I know
autonomous
Columbus
vehicle
is
usage.
the
Columbus in particular,
particular
but
is listed, um, but that's just a side. This is still the introduction here.
gotcha.
Um, and then you know, there's also what we call the more speculative end of transportation, like hyperloops. The hyperloop concept in Las Vegas has kind of died here in the United States, and largely is because I think the hyperloop it wasn't that it wasn't successful, it was a test of the technology that SpaceX was doing to see how useful it would be, like on the moon or Mars, where we wouldn't be driving out on the surface in vehicles. It's just like it's like the Tesla pickup truck is a the Cybertruck is really a test of a vehicle that's more practical for use in other environments, not here in the United States, where pickup trucks are kind of king. Um, so transportation innovation is colliding with policy.
Correct.
Um, I have been a long-term proponent, particularly as we move to um, not so much hybrid vehicles, because hybrid vehicles still, the way we pay for our highway infrastructure in the United States is through road tax primarily, and a little bit through it's just another form of tax, but through the fees, licensing fees. But licensing fees don't make up initially when they started doing pure EV vehicles, the licensing fee for an EV vehicle was the same as a hybrid vehicle was the same as a regular gas vehicle or diesel vehicle. Uh, my personal opinion is that should not be the case, um, because and and I've argued this for a long time. You can go back every transportation we've done, over the last 100 episodes, and I've said the same thing is they got to figure out a way to properly tax electric vehicles. My wife drives a hybrid, and her vehicle registration is greater than my pickup truck, which is actually kind of makes sense because it's a hybrid vehicle. She's getting much better gas mileage. They're not making their money up to pay for the roads that we're all driving on. How are we going to do it? And for people, if we have any non-US listeners, we have a federal road tax, we have a state road tax in every state in the nation. Well, not every state. There's a couple states that don't have a state road tax.
You talking gas tax?
Yeah, gas tax.
Yeah.
And it's added to every gallon of gas that you purchase, or gallon of petrol. And we're not talking liters, baby. Talking gallons. And then there's in a lot of places there is a local road tax as well. That's all collected on the gas, and all of that combines covers federal highways, state highways, and local roads. And that's how it largely gets funded everywhere in the United States. And so you have electric vehicles, well, they're no longer paying that. They may be paying for electric to charge up, but they're not paying the
Yeah,
road tax. And they
but that's a
still,
whole different set of taxes
yeah,
that's not earmarked
for
for road maintenance.
so um and I actually experienced this um in New Zealand back in 2019 when we were there. Um they actually, so they kind of do a hybrid thing. So they kind of pay for their roads. If you're a passenger vehicle, like a car or a van, New Zealand is like the UK. There's not a whole lot of pickup trucks, and if they are, they're like really small. They're not half-ton vehicles, they're like quarter-ton vehicles. They're like the size of a Nissan Pup, or that's like your average pickup truck in those places. Um, but lorries, motorhomes, um, horse boxes, they all had a mileage meter on one of the axles of the vehicle, and those also paid a mileage tax for how many miles they drove those vehicles, because they, being bigger, heavier vehicles, they put more stress on the road. And if you don't believe me, there is a California EPA um, uh, study that was produced back in the late 80s that discovered that in the United States that semi trucks and tractors did the same amount, or did uh, 10,000. Well, they did 10,000 cars worth of damage, and when they meant cars, they meant um, you know traditional two-axle vehicles. So pickup trucks, vans, and sedans and coupes and all of those. So a single semi truck does the same amount of damage as 10,000 cars per year to the highway system. That brings up another question of why semi trucks aren't taxed and the registration doesn't cost 10,000 times more than it does for a passenger vehicle.
Well, and now you're talking about interstate commerce,
Yeah.
and that's another whole thing.
But they do pay the road taxes, and they also pay a much higher proportion, since they're driving. If you drive your passenger vehicle in the United States, it's not uncommon. It's hard to believe this. A lot of my friends, particularly in the UK, have a hard, and in New Zealand, have a hard time understanding this. But it is not uncommon in the United States to drive anywhere between 5 and 10,000 miles on a vehicle in a year. I mean, and I know people, depending on the industry, that drive 20 to 25,000 miles on a vehicle in a year. So, but that's not
I
10,000 is not uncommon.
probably do that driving back and forth to Columbus
Correct.
so many times a year. I mean, that's fairly easy to do.
Yeah, exactly. Um, so, but in smaller countries, people just don't drive everywhere either. But again, they're not as big, so uh, there's common transportation to get around. Like the UK has a New Zealand does not, but the UK has a really good busing system. They have a really good train system. You want to go from the New Forest in the south of England to the north of England. You can take a train relatively inexpensively from one end of the country to the other. You cannot do that via Amtrak in the United States, you know, and that's a whole nother thing
Hmm.
to talk about. But the UK is looking for on EVs to do the same thing that New Zealand has done on larger vehicles, and that is to do mileage tax to collect that ability to get the money to maintain the roadways. And they're doing it on electric and plug-in hybrid vehicles, which I think is kind of weird, but I guess they get the gas tax at least partially from gasoline hybrid vehicles or petrol hybrid vehicles. Um, and they're saying that they would do it just kind of like New Zealand does. Pure EVs would get a higher per rate mile per plug than plug-in hybrids, and that to reflect the fact that EV drivers they avoid all fuel taxes. You know, we've talked about this concept a lot um, in the past because as the government was pushing for EVs for years and years and years, I kept saying, well, how are they going to pay for the roads? You know,
Well, I still don't think there's anything approaching a consensus on that front. Um, and I don't know that there's gonna be. Um, if the only real solution is a uh, creation of a EV only road infrastructure, which no one will pay for.
yeah.
So,
Well, heck, in today's environment, that would be like saying, let's build a data center on every highway.
right.
People don't want to give up the property. They don't want extra roads. I mean, we hear about all of the bad things, like when they brought the highway system, the federal highway system, about in the 50s and 60s, and how they routed it through minority neighborhoods and things intentionally in Washington D.C. But they never talk about the fact that the federal highway system, when they put it in more rural places, like I-64 in Kentucky is a good example, they ended up bisecting people's farm properties with no good way to get from one side of the property to the other. My grandparents' farm, when I was growing up, was one of those properties where I-64 ran through the center of their farmland. And we had to take this god awful, like, we literally, you used to be, and I didn't know this way because I-64 had been there since I was born. But you used to be able to drive out the backyard of the house into the pasture. And when I-64 came through, there was a small barn that sat in my grandparents' backyard, and then the highway, which has an easement on each side, a huge easement, and then for my grandfather to go and work his property, we had to get in a pickup truck and drive 2 miles down the road, make a right, drive another 2 miles under an overpass for I-64, and then make a right to get back to his on a rural road to get back to another access point to his property where the majority of his farmland existed. They don't talk about that. So, getting another a lane of or a separate highway for EVs or a separate highway, for semi traffic would be really, really, really difficult because nobody wants to go through, even though there's very few people who have that memory, nobody's today, you're going to get the same, probably a more voracious reaction uh, to trying to bisect property again. I mean, Dayton's a good example. We have a quarter of a beltway around the city because initially 675 was supposed to go all the way around Dayton as a beltway to, again, take traffic off of going through downtown Dayton on I-75. Uh, and they built the section from South 75 to East I-70, and that's the only section they've ever built. And that was done in the late 70s, early 80s. Because they talked about the section that was supposed to go from South 75 west to West I-70, and all the communities threw their hands up in the air and said, "Look, you can't do that. You'll be, building the highway through residential areas and and protected farmlands and all of this."
Eminent domain is good for all of that.
Yeah, I mean,
They don't care.
I know,
Government does not care about your inconvenience of working your land. This highway must be built, and it must be built here.
but back then, eminent domain, they would just enforce it.
Yeah.
Today, it's a much harder sell
Well,
because everybody's worried about, well, if
there's a
I do this,
political price now.
correct, there's political price. Yep. Yep.
Whereas, before you can't beat town hall. Now you just vote them out of office or make them look like total idiots on the internet, and then eventually somebody makes a mistake and gets run out of town.
Yeah.
I mean, that is what it is.
So, and I'm sure this is kind of old news, but Ford is unwinding parts of its earlier EV strategy. Particularly, they sunsetted the F-150 Lightning production, which I thought was the dumbest thing in the world anyway. Um, the Ford F-150 is the number one selling vehicle worldwide. They're used by governments all over the world. They're used by farmers all over the world. They're in particularly used by all the construction companies all over the world. Um, None of them want an electric vehicle that has a certain runtime, and as cool as some of the stuff that it did, like you could power your house from it in a power outage and all this other stuff. It didn't make sense. Um, it wasn't useful for towing livestock trailers. It wasn't useful for towing construction trailers. Um,
This is
you don't see
another.
John Deere and Ford New Holland and Case International going, "Hey, let's take these giant tractors that we use to plow thousands of acres of the land and let's make them EVs." Nobody asked for it, and they
But that's because
did not deliver.
your typical cone-headed liberal eco-weenie isn't operating in that space. The truck they can point at and say, let's make that an EV.
Yeah.
Because,
Well, I mean, again, it's one of the most popular, and it's almost a status symbol in suburban America.
but I don't get how
How many neighborhoods do you drive through and you see people with F-150s parked in their driveways, and you're like, they don't haul anything in that. You know, the beds, there's no dirt in the bed. They're
not a single scratch on it. Yeah, no, look, I don't see how Ford was able to sell it to their shareholders
Oh, I
to
agree.
say, here's our biggest worldwide selling #1 vehicle, and we're going to do something different with it.
Yeah.
Now, I can see if you're going to build a variant, but to shut down normal, and I don't know if they even did this. Did they shut down normal F-150
No, they
production?
did
They
not.
couldn't.
They couldn't.
So, what difference does it make if
Yeah.
they shut down the experiment because Joe Biden got kicked out of
Yeah.
office?
Well,
Nobody
and
cared.
now what's funny is on I-65 south of Louisville, they built these massive, massive battery plants. And so, um, and they're completely up in operation. Now they're kind of pivoting to selling those battery systems. I mean, they're using some of it for production of their other EV and hybrid vehicles that need batteries. But the majority of it is now pivoting to battery storage, which makes more sense to me than trying to, let's EV our entire fleet of, everything that we sell. I mean, the uh, the Mustang Mach E, which is kind of a if you look at it, it's really a crossover vehicle, but it's supposed to be, a high horsepower Tesla like EV. It's not selling well. I think I've seen two on the roads ever. But
Well,
what did they do? As soon as they dropped the electric F-150, they brought back the regular Mustang because those sell and it's the Mustang is the only car that Ford makes anymore.
so again, the market will determine these things.
Exactly, which we've been saying for years.
This is why when Joe Biden's auto pen decides that car companies must build EVs and stop building gas guzzlers, and the market says, no, Joe Biden's auto pen, that's not what needs to happen.
Well, I'm the reason Ford decided to do it is because they were getting government subsidies to do it. And
Precisely
when Joe
my
Biden
point.
was out of office, the government subsidies went away, so we can't do this anymore. Um, and don't get me wrong, Ford learned a lot about it, uh, and they did it in such a way because they weren't the only one. General Motors was getting, and almost all of General Motors electric vehicles are gone too. Um, you know, American car companies were getting paid to convert,
I,
and the other problem happened too is part of all that legislation is they were supposed to build out an EV network of chargers.
well, they didn't do that either.
Well, they didn't do that because who would that hurt the most?
Well,
The
gas
oil industry.
stations.
The oil industry is an embedded industry that you have the major oil companies and then you have the jobber companies. And the jobber companies are the guys who actually own the gas stations. And so like one of the local jobber companies around us is a company called Giant Oil. Giant Oil owns marathons and speedways and the and uh Lord, I'm trying to think of other gas stations. Shells, they own Shells. Uh, you know, they they don't care who. Basically, they sign an agreement with the oil companies saying that you provide us gasoline and diesel, um, and we'll buy it at a certain rate, and we'll call our gas station a Shell gas station, uh, and because gas stations don't make that much money on the gasoline sales themselves. The road taxes make the most money, and then they make their money on the convenience stores and the other services that they provide. That's what the jobbers do, and it's this. It's kind of like the auto industry. You have the automakers, and then you have the dealerships, and you had Tesla out here going, "No, we don't need dealerships." And so, there were states that fought that because there was legislation. Well, that was because you have this embedded industry who has lobbyists who've lobbied for certain legislation over time, and then they lobbied again when these newcomers come out to enforce that legislation.
Government is a protection racket.
Yeah,
Uh,
I think it's funny what in the state of Ohio what Tesla did, and that is they actually built dealerships, but they're all owned by Tesla, which circumvented the law.
I,
And I'm all for that.
me too.
But it's kind of funny. I have been saying for a long time, nobody should be pushing this. It's a market demand situation. If it becomes to where, because for a long time EVs, it was a premium to buy an EV that was actually less functional than a much cheaper gasoline or diesel powered vehicle. And I always said the best solution has always been, a gas or diesel hybrid situation anyway, where you're increasing the gas mileage. I mean, it's kind of funny. Um, my Ford Maverick is not the hybrid model. I have the bigger engine, which is it's over 200 horsepower. But I get on a pickup truck, a half-ton pickup truck, because the Maverick is a half-ton pickup truck. I get 30 miles, 32 miles to the gallon combined. My wife has a late model Ford Escape hybrid, three-cylinder gas engine, hybrid electric. She gets on if she's just doing highway miles, she gets the same mileage that I get. But when she's driving around town and everything, she gets like 42 to 45 miles to the gallon. And that is an extreme savings. She doesn't drive her car on the highway like I do. So, that makes sense to me, because the economics work out. Um, but, you know, to force the industry through legislation to try to,
Well, that's market
yeah,
manipulation, and anytime government tries to do that, it
Central Planning Committee.
very rarely is that successful. I
Exactly.
mean, it just very rarely.
Well, and again, I think Ford was in a rock and a hard place in some respect. They wanted to take advantage, and their shareholders were probably demanding take advantage of these government subsidies. Because I've always said that I don't believe in these programs, but if they're giving you free money, you're stupid not to take it. You know, as
What
long as long as the return is not, that there's no really hard stipulations in the return. Um,
the issue comes when you start talking about the supply chain. Now you're talking about that battery company that
yes,
that whole plant is now useless, and so those people are losing their jobs, and that's all because government stuck their nose in something that the market didn't ask for.
yeah,
and
absolutely.
and so those employees are going to be pissed at Ford when they should be pissed at Joe Biden's auto pen. Let's
Well,
be
the
real
reality of
about
it
that.
is these battery. I don't believe these battery factories for Ford. They actually laid any people off because I don't think they actually employed that many people. The battery plants are here in the United States are largely automated, so they got to keep the skilled trades that keep the robots running anyway. Now, And it's not like Ford's stopping building battery plants. They built that one south of Louisville. They're building one in Pulaski, Tennessee, which is um, about 20 miles from the border of Alabama on I-65 as well. Um, building similar technologies. The idea is, they need to have the battery production, but I think what Ford's figured out is, the massive batteries that we built for these F-150 Lightnings, because we knew they would need, because that was part of the problem. You took a vehicle that is already a heavy vehicle, and you're making it heavier by putting batteries in it. Which kind of goes back to the, okay, we've taken a half-ton vehicle and we've made it heavier. So how much more damage is it doing to the highway system? That now that it's an EV is not paying for
But
any
hey,
gas
man, we get to hug a tree, and that's all that matters.
until the battery catches fire and we can't put it out.
I'm just saying, man, hug that tree, because that's what the whole thing is about.
So another fun Waymo story in San Francisco. Go figure, where Waymo is like everything. Uh, a robotaxi struck a small unleashed dog in San
Hmm.
Francisco, and it has triggered a new wave of public criticism and regulatory questions on robotaxis.
Sure.
So the incident revives, should AVs be held to human level safety or significantly better? Um, how should we weigh rare but emotionally charged events against the overall crash statistics?
That
But killing an animal or killing a person,
that car should be incarcerated for life.
yes. Well,
That's
so let's ask that question. Um, that brings up a few questions. So one of them is who is liable? So if that was a person, there would be real liability there. If it uh, there's actually real liability if it's a dog. The fact that the dog was unleashed, unfortunately, would temper that liability. Um, but um, who's liable? How did they determine that? Is Waymo liable? You know,
is the guy who rented the car liable?
liable. Yeah.
Uh,
Is the city of San Francisco liable because they allowed the Waymo taxis?
is the state of California liable because they didn't regulate the industry?
Yeah. And so all of
Not that
those.
I'm calling for regulation of the industry,
Well,
but you get what I'm saying.
yeah.
These are how lawyers think. Uh,
Well, and the thing is residents of communities and policymakers locally, statewide, even federally, are now under pressure to reconsider how to respond to this. Particularly since the only place they've tested robotaxis are in really dense urban areas. You know, Now I don't know what the statistics are on Waymo accidents, um,
one is one too many.
but you know,
These systems are supposed to be infallible.
well, the problem with infallibility in an automated system like this is if all of the cars were automated, that it could be infallible, which unless until it isn't though. Um, the problem is that it would make it much.
Look, I'm all for making sci-fi dreams a reality, but this is one
Again,
that
this is another Minority Report type thing,
it
or
really is.
you know, we have automated vehicles driving everybody around.
And it doesn't address the main concern of transportation in the first place, which is when I want to go somewhere, I don't want to have to wait.
Correct.
Because you still have to wait for the thing to arrive and then take you where you got to go. And then when it's time for you to come back home, now you got to call for another one.
Well, there's
And
other
that's just
things. There,
wasted
there,
time.
there's a lot of. I've read a lot of, because I don't have any personal experience. I haven't been out to San Francisco since like 2016. I haven't needed to, and so I haven't experienced Waymo. taxis and how they work. But through anecdotal evidence, people telling me what they've seen and reading a lot of articles, you know, there are neighborhoods who've had to block off parts of their streets because the Waymo taxis use their dead end cul-de-sac to turn around in, and they have bright flashlights that or flashlight headlights that flash into their houses all through the night. Um,
I've seen stories where Waymos have gotten confused and basically shut down, and
in
ambulances can't get
hang on,
around
found
them,
it.
and
Yeah, they're
emergency
in the middle of a
services, yeah,
street.
they're
Um,
they're just a menace.
and yeah, and police can't move them because once they shut down, they like lock up for
Yeah.
security reasons. Um, I've seen stories about how the Waymos have caused traffic backups and traffic congestion.
The most hilarious video I've seen is one of those where the cop comes up to the Waymo and is trying to get the guy that's in the back seat to move the car.
Uh huh.
And he's like, What do you want me to do?
Exactly.
I can't drive the
All
car."
right. Exactly.
And the
So
cop tried to get this guy to be liable for it. They're a menace. They're a menace.
well, the Waymo system would make more sense. You literally talk about in an urban area, if they operated on like their own hyperloop or their own subway style road system, where they're the only vehicles on those systems. But then you lose the convenience of a Waymo picking you up outside your front door, you know.
Which defeats the whole purpose of having a transportation system if you have to go somewhere in order to use it.
Well,
You know,
the other thing I question about Waymos is, so like I don't know what the situation is in the way they license taxi drivers um, in San Francisco, but I do know that in like Chicago, where I've used taxis a lot, and I mean a lot, and in New York where I've used taxis a lot, they both have a similar system to where the people who own the taxi companies have to buy what's called a shield, which is a license per vehicle. And not only do they have to be certified to a certain level to be able to buy a shield, which are auctioned. They're not like, they're you want to put so many more taxis in your fleet. You have to wait until somebody goes out of business or decides they're going to sell their business, and then their shields go up for auction, and you fight for them. Um,
I, I,
and
struggle with that too, because I
yeah,
think as a system that's market manipulation, and I don't
it
know that
is.
that's
Well, I mean,
particularly
and there's,
useful.
they're still fighting. All these guys, the traditional taxi companies, are still fighting. Um, the Ubers and Lyfts, because they're not they're providing the same functionality as these licensed shielded, because that's the whole idea, is that because they license, there's a set of liability that they're certified to take on behalf of the city. That's the concept, uh to be a licensed taxi driver. In reality, you get the same crazies driving those as you do driving
Where
lifts.
where is providing taxi services a function of government? I,
Well, it's a tax generation methodology. That's the only reason the shields exist.
so
you know,
market manipulation again
yeah.
is the end result of that. I,
But,
it's not about liability; it's about revenue enhancement.
yeah. And that's my curiosity about Waymo and San Francisco, is what revenue enhancement did San Francisco get? for Waymo. I mean,
Well,
look at all the scooter companies that were out there that don't no longer exist.
um, well, again, I think the Waymo thing is just another fad.
Yeah.
I don't know that, and scooters are a good comparison there because that was all the rage for a while, and I, you can go into some bigger cities and still see them, but it's nowhere near as prolific as it was.
No.
So if I were looking to invest in something, I don't know that Waymo would be
Where I would do it.
where I would do it.
Well, and in certain states and certain cities, taxi drivers and bus drivers are a unionized labor force.
Well, and then there's that more market manipulation,
Yeah.
and these things are going to be what they're going to be until we destroy them. Uh,
Yeah. So let's talk about hyperloops. So Hyperloop One, which I had mentioned before in Vegas, was actually imploded. It was a test. Um, but Europe is planning Hyperloop projects. Now, partly Europe has to do this. They there's not, I mean, European countries, if you take the individual countries that make up the European Union, or you take up the UK and its individual countries slash states that make up the United Kingdom, I mean, most of them combined don't have the space that even some of our smaller states have here in the United States. Um, so for them to build new highway systems, uh, to particularly add to new systems for transportation in urban centers, because their urban centers are hundreds of years old, and there's no moving some of these massive buildings that sit on these narrow streets that were designed for people to either walk or ride horses on. And they have to go to a hyperloop type solution, and the hyperloop is really designed in their case to go between cities. And you know so so the you know the it's the same thing that they presented here in the United States. um Hyperloops claim to relieve congestion. They enable near airline speeds, but on land.
we'll come back to that.
They, cost, capacity, and engineering challenges remain unresolved. Um, from a skeptic uh, implementation engineering capability, it kind of sits between. It's in a limbo between visionary and a visionary infrastructure concept and a really expensive science project, which is what Hyperloop One in Vegas was.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, Again, hyperloops in the United States to some degree, but I mean they'd have to be massive. Um, would make some sense. Uh, like if you could create a hyperloop system that was ground transportation that went from New York to LA, which you couldn't do. Flying would still be faster,
Yeah,
uh, because
that's
you would have to route around natural, uh, you know, landmarks and things and aquifers. You can't put the hyperloop in the middle of Nebraska, where that giant underground aquifer that waters all of our farmland in the country lives. Um,
this is another technology solution looking for a problem. Uh, I don't see what problem this thing actually solves.
I don't think so on terrestrial Earth. I can see where the hyperloop makes sense in, you know, as we expand out into other planets, because
Again, I'm all for it, because then you're going to your city planning will have taken that into account
Oh,
as that's being your primary mode of transportation.
yeah.
Here, I
Well,
mean,
I mean, you know, the
even in
whole
Europe, I don't think this solves any problems
no,
for
I
them.
don't either. Well, the thing is, you know, because they Europe has a huge train system, you know, and they've had it for decades and decades.
And if it were going to solve that problem, it would
Would have
have.
exactly.
What's a faster train going to do that a normal speed train doesn't? I, that
Yeah.
isn't solving
I mean,
anything.
if to me, you know, the idea of the Hyperloop was that it's a, you know, underground high speed transportation system that you pull your car into, and it's kind of like a ferry boat except over land, you know, between places, and it gets you somewhere fast. Um, and then, you know, when you arrive at your destination, you putz around in your local vehicle. Um,
Now, build me a hyperloop between Los Angeles and Tokyo.
yeah,
Now we're talking about something.
exactly.
But I don't see that as a thing that
But I mean,
solves any
but
problems
I mean,
on
why couldn't
land.
you just build train cars that act as a ferry, and you drive your car up onto this train car, and you ride in your car on the train instead of riding in a passenger car, you know? Because where are you going to get off the hyperloop when you have to pee? You're going to have to wait until you get your destination, or pee in a bottle in your car.
Well, I'm sure that Elon would have thought about having uh, a way to monetize that situation, because that's when you have a trapped customer base. Your whole goal is to extract as much money from them as possible.
But again, that makes the hyperloop makes sense for when you're thinking about Mars. And the reason is because to avoid, you know, it has a thin atmosphere, to avoid or stray radiation, they're already talking about building most of the structures that they would inhabit and everything underground. It would also be the most logical place to find frozen water and other stuff. So building a massive tunnel system, you know, to put your Cybertruck on and go from, you know, one station to the next. Um,
Here's the problem with that. You're talking about frozen water and all that. Now, that's the same thing as the Nebraska aquifer problem.
yeah,
Again, this is a neat technology, a sci-fi dream in
it,
search of an actual problem.
album. You're right. I
I
don't
just
disagree with
I
you.
just can't, man.
I don't disagree with you.
I love the idea. I just we missed that particular boat, so to speak.
Yep. So I think we'll wrap it up right there. Please send feedback to gizmosapiens@gmail.com. That's GizmoSapiens@gmail.com. And we'll see you on the digital flip side.
You've been listening to Gizmo Sapiens, a technology and entertainment podcast. You can reach us at our email address at gizmosapiens@gmail.com. That's GizmoSapiens@gmail.com. We'd really love to hear from you, and we'll see you next week from the digital flip side.